Dr. Robert Scare is a neurologist and internationally recognized trauma researcher and lecturer based in Boulder, Colorado. His books include The Body Bears the Burden, Trauma, Dissociation, and Disease, and The Trauma Spectrum, Hidden Wounds and Human Resiliency. He also maintains the website traumasoma.com, where he has many articles suitable for physicians and laypeople alike. I had the opportunity to have a frank, intimate conversation with Bob about the new traumatology, the trauma spectrum, and its implications for individuals and society alike. We met in Boulder, Colorado in 2010. Bob, I've got two books. One, The Body Bears the Burden, which I understand has two editions.
Yes, that's first edition.
First edition is what I have here, which I'm proud to say I made it through.
Congratulations.
In my earliest times, I came into this and I was like, this is painful. You know, it was challenging. And I sat in San Diego County reading this many pages over and over again. But I understand the new version, the second edition, has kind of been rewritten for more accessibility for other people, or?
Yes, I rewrote most of the book to make it more lay user-friendly.
Right. So that's like not just added sections per se, but actual terminology readjusted or explanations put in.
Oh yes, and different phraseology and different terms, and all the medical terms are explained. I wrote the first book for doctors as a document that I hoped someday somebody would read and would change their minds. But I wrote it for physicians, and therefore I put it in medicalese.
Certainly you did. The language that medical doctors would be most appreciative to, like, say, oh, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Right. Well, I'm excited that was there and that I could get through that. And then you also did The Trauma Spectrum, Hidden Wounds and Human Resiliency. That's kind of, sometimes I think of this as kind of your more independent thinking on the subject. Is that?
Yes, it is. There were some new ideas I needed to bring out, which prompted the second book. And the original title I proposed was Trauma Tells the Tale.
Trauma tells the tale.
Understanding Your Life.
Oh, wow. Quite a more personal direction there.
Because I felt by this time that trauma was ubiquitous. It affected all of us in some ways. That everybody experienced this phenomenon in their lives, and that it had a profound effect on all of their life choices.
Right. Well, that's great. I think that's probably exactly where we're going to get to. Right. So let's kind of review just on the way there, though. Who are you? You're a neurologist. You ran a pain clinic in Boulder, Colorado for some 20 plus years.
Yeah, I was acting medical director of a rehabilitation center.
Okay.
Which means that during the course of that 20 years, I directed almost all of the programs at one time or another, including a chronic pain program.
And so you were in charge of doctors, you were in charge of treatment plans, treatment protocols. You also met with patients themselves, I suppose?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I directed programs and did a lot of administrative meetings and also clinical meetings with teams, various teams. Brain injury program, pediatric rehabilitation, inpatient rehab, chronic pain, sports medicine.
Just about everything that we would normally end up associating now, at least with the new traumatology, with things that would kind of be in that field. So you had a long history of kind of working in what eventually gets around to traumatic stress issues.
It did, because rehabilitation implies that there has been an event which has been physically, cognitively, or emotionally disabling to some extent, and which requires rehabilitation.
Precisely.
And from the start, I brought in psychologists. The rehab center did not have a psychologist, and ultimately all the programs had a psychologist because I recognized the emotional content associated with disability.
So from the start, in some way, you were already kind of taking maybe a different approach?
Well, most large rehabilitation centers have psychological support systems.
Okay.
They hadn't really gotten around to that when I took over in 1980.
1980.
Yeah.
And before that, you were trained as a medical doctor, Neurologist, so brain science kind of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I practiced that for 11 years.
And you practiced that for 11 years.
Right.
So in the general sense, we can say, as far as we understand it, within the field, you've been trained in terms of how the brain works, what it does, and when you see abnormalities, what part of the brain might be at issue there, not functioning ideally.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
We also did orthopedic rehabilitation, and hip replacements and that sort of thing.
Right.
But a good part of it was neurological rehabilitation.
Good part of it was neurological.
Right.
And I take it that at some point along your career path there, some kind of shift took place where you started looking with a different lens in terms of what was going on within the brain processing of your clients, your patients, and how would be best, what methods would be best to treat them. That's true?
That's right. The last 6 years I took over the direction of the chronic pain program. The physician who'd been doing it left, and I had trouble recruiting somebody, so I took it over and actually enjoyed it. And while I was doing that, and even before then I'd known that, I realized that severe emotional distress was common in chronic pain patients. Makes sense.
Makes sense.
However, there was a disproportionate number who suffered from what we call Axis 2 diagnoses, personality disorders. And the one that was most prominent was borderline personality disorder.
Really, the flip-flop back and forth between, how would you describe that, borderline personality? It's kind of like...
It's a state of severe emotional dysregulation with periods of rage, periods of terror, periods of profound depression.
And then elation as well?
No.
No.
Unfortunately, never elation.
No, never elation.
Mostly negative emotional instability.
Right.
And there was also a manipulative aspect and also a self-preservation aspect. And so these patients were very manipulative, would try to turn staff members against each other. Mm-hmm. And so we had weekly and sometimes twice weekly team meetings to deal with these kinds of patients who made it very hard for the staff to stay cohesive.
Wow, just from the internal intensity
Yes.
of working with the client, with these patients. And so you were kind of seeing that behavior. What would your original model have suggested about what was going on here? People were defiant, or they were kind of resistant, or what would have been the...
There was no basis in the literature for the understanding of why this personality disorder would be predisposed to developing chronic pain.
Huh.
And it was a puzzle. And we thought it was psychological, but we didn't know what the mechanism was.
And you would have active conversations about it?
All the time.
Right, all the time.
Because we had to protect the staff integrity, because there was a constant effort to turn us against each other.
Right.
It was a challenge. And borderline personality disorders are a challenge in the psychotherapy field, and they're well known to create chaos. But why? That was the question.
Right.
And I had no idea why, until one of my therapists gave me an article by Peter Levine.
Do you remember which one that was?
It was one of his standalone articles on his work. And I read the article and I thought, this explains my chronic pain patients.
Just like that?
Yeah. I said, this describes the borderline personality disorder frequently, where there are multiple somatic complaints, and it describes me to a certain extent.
You personally?
Yes. I applied it to my own life experience, my method of coping with things, my way of thinking, and I recognized that there were things about this that I participated in too.
So, were you predisposed to this kind of like self-analysis, or like had you been doing that kind of thing before, or did this article just speak to you in just the right way that, or was it just the time of your life to make that happen, or?
No, I've always been curious.
You've always been curious.
I was going to be a psychiatrist.
Okay.
Before I became a neurologist, I was very interested in the mind and in the disorders of the mind. I was a psychology major in college. So I had a baseline background in psychology. And I thought about those things. And I thought about why people are the way they are and why they feel the way they feel, why they act the way they act. I'd always been curious about the human mind and behavior.
So you were already on the curiosity side. You were essentially looking for the piece of the puzzle that would kind of fall into place, that would explain some of these things that you were...
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing that he wrote about, of course, was the somatic symptoms of trauma.
Right. The basis of his work, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which incorporated a lot of symptoms having to do with chronic psychosomatic illness.
Psychosomatic being the term that medical science puts on things that can't be traced to definitive causes, per se.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of my patients in the pain program, and I have to say I'd seen thousands of whiplash patients because...
Car accidents.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
We had a brain injury program, we had physical therapy, and we became a center for auto accident rehabilitation. And I frequently then started to get referrals of these patients to incorporate into our rehabilitation center. And I got so I was seeing at least 2 to 3 new auto accident victims a week.
Well, that's a lot of opportunity to kind of take intakes, learn about what's happening for people, learn about what people's responses are to these things.
Yeah. And these patients, most of them, 90% were women, and 90% had accidents under the speed of 10 miles per hour.
What was that saying to you before you came upon Peter's work?
Well, the people in my brain injury program quoted literature that with a 10-mile-an-hour accident you could have a brain injury, because all of these people had brain injury too. They had cognitive complaints.
Cognitive complaints, sore muscles, necks, kind of hypertone there, tension.
Yes.
What are some of the other things that go along with?
They had visual complaints. They couldn't focus near when they couldn't read, and they had trouble focusing or shifting focus. They had vertigo and dizziness when they moved their head. They had ringing in the ears.
Right.
They had temporomandibular joint syndrome. They began to brux and clench at night.
Clenching their teeth at night?
Yeah. They all had this
startle response, hyperarousal?
Exaggerated startle.
Exaggerated startle.
And they all had the same symptoms, to one degree or another. And they also had bowel complaints.
Really?
And they had palpitation. They had visceral complaints too, the gut and the lungs and the heart.
From a 10-mile-an-hour car accident?
10-mile-an-hour crash.
Okay, so for some time, you're kind of looking at all of that, curious and recognizing the psychological component that must be present, but then not, as far as I can tell, having a distinct answer for these things.
No particular answer, but this feeling of unease about the fact that the symptoms, and especially the brain injury diagnosis, were not compatible with the severity of the accident.
No, it's just not the image of a high impact kind of thing that would. So some day comes along and somebody hands you an article by Peter Levine, and the light goes off, I guess.
Well, the light went off that this may be more of an experience than an injury.
An experience than an injury.
Right.
An experience than an injury. Could we also say then more of an experience than an event?
Well, in other words, that the symptoms were caused by the nature of the experience, not by the impact and the disruption of physical functions of the brain, spine, and body otherwise.
The experience
something may have created this syndrome, and it was always the same, which was very strange that they would all have the same symptoms. They also all had emotional distress to one degree or another. A lot of them had actually PTSD, but I didn't know much about PTSD, and it wasn't until after I read Levine's article that I began to ask them about all of the symptoms of PTSD. And most of them had it.
That you went back and asked your patients about those symptoms. And PTSD being post-traumatic stress disorder, which is kind of a clinically relevant or accepted understanding of kind of a degree of traumatic stress.
Exactly.
Right. So, having read your books, having had the opportunity to listen to you lecture and everything, I'm aware that you then kind of took that information and just started to run with it. Is
Well,
that,
yeah.
is that like, how did that go down?
Peter describes the basic physiology of trauma in his book.
Waking the Tiger.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I dived into the PTSD literature. I started to read. I started out with a lot of articles by Bessel van der Kolk, who was well-known, had really had evolved some of the early seminal concepts of trauma with dissociation, with the involvement of the body, and the body keeps the score.
Right. In his book or article?
That's an article.
That's an article.
Yeah.
The body keeps the score.
Yes. And when I read that, I realized that there was a physiological disruption in PTSD, which would result in destabilization of the body and the brain, and specifically the autonomic nervous system. And that this might explain all of the visceral, the gut, the heart symptoms. And then applying the memory mechanisms involved, in other words, unconscious procedural memory, as being a critical element of the storage of information at the time of trauma that would involve the body, I began to see that all of the physical symptoms of whiplash could be explained by the combination of destabilization of the autonomic nervous system and procedural memory for all of the sensations that occurred in that injury.
Okay. That is kind of like looking into a window then, like kind of like looking through a little lens into this, I don't know, cacophony or just this ever-expanding possibility of what could be going on in terms of I have this symptom, another person has this symptom, but you're describing kind of tracking it all through the functioning, the regulatory functioning of the autonomic nervous system.
Exactly.
And the role that procedural memory is playing in there.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a moment, if we can, and just have you break down what you mean by the autonomic nervous system and what you mean by procedural memory, and perhaps in relevance to declarative memory, so that people can be aware of how you mean those terms. Because it sounds to me like that's the kind of the central understanding that you finally came to, that if we can understand how those processes work, then we can understand what they're going to cause in terms of symptom, expression, experiential nature.
And they did explain everything that I'd seen for these 20 years in neurology in these patients who didn't make sense.
Well, that must have been something of a liberating moment or a time period to kind of go, oh, that's what this is all about.
It lit my passion fire, because I thought, I think I'm right here, and nobody else knows this.
Yeah. What do you do with that?
This has never been in the literature.
What do you do with that?
Well, I wrote an article. I wrote an article for a magazine called Bridges, which is the magazine for ICEM, the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energy and Energy Medicine. It's a very eclectic society having to do with energy medicine, which is acupuncture. It involves some pretty what we call far-out concepts having to do with energy and the way it affects the body and the way the body generates it. But I was able to, I wrote a little article for that because I could get it published.
Right, because they're likely to go along with some new ideas, being on the edge of those kind of ideas.
And then based on that, I got invited to give actually a plenary lecture at it used to be called the Biofeedback Society of America. And I'd been involved with biofeedback since the 80s, actually since the 70s. And I gave a lecture on this concept at that society, which was very exciting, and people were very energized by it. And so they asked me to write an article about my talk for their journal, which I did. And I also wrote an article on whiplash that I finally got published in the Journal of Cognitive Therapy. So I was starting to get some information out there.
It's kind of like a step-by-step process, building up things.
Yeah. But of course, I couldn't get these articles published in peer-reviewed journals. They said I was crazy.
Did you try and have response from them?
I tried, and I had one. I referred it to the Journal of Chronic Pain and something related to physical medicine. Oh, the Journal of Neuromuscular Pain.
Okay. Now, at the time, I suppose now your thoughts on all of this is quite a bit more refined than it was at the time.
Far.
If you could summarize what you were saying then in those initial articles.
Okay. I was saying that, and I didn't answer your initial question.
But I think this will help you get back to it too.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
What I talked about was that procedural memory for these traumatic events was stored when the event was traumatized, was traumatic enough to result in a fight-flight response, which is a sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
And then, because the patient was helpless, to result in a freeze response, which of course Peter writes about extensively and is a basis for a lot of his theories.
Exactly.
And I borrowed from that with regards to the importance of the freeze response. Mm-hmm. Because in the freeze response, and this is Peter's work, I mean, this is all of his conceptualization.
Which has been very helpful to the field in general. I mean, we're all kind of standing on high shoulders that he set out for us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Animals who are freeze, like an opossum or a gazelle on the Kalahari Plain, run to the ground by a cheetah who freezes because they're helpless. Mm-hmm. If they're not killed, they'll come out of the freeze, and they'll come out of it with a shaking. They'll tremble and shake like a seizure.
Exactly.
And there's a famous polar bear video that I use in every lecture that shows a bear who's been anesthetized for tagging and who comes out of it and goes through what looks like a grand mal seizure. But in point of fact, and this is a National Geographic film, and the people observing it don't talk about the fact that the act that the animal is coming out of, is creating when he's coming out of this freeze, is a replication of what he was doing before.
And that's the procedural memory piece that you're
Exactly.
describing. So procedural memory is that's the implicit memory of the body system, right? Like what the body remembers, how to ride a bicycle.
Yeah, it has to do with skills.
Skills.
How we acquire skills is through practice. And as the more we do it, the more it is stored in parts of our brain in a very more precise way so that we can replicate the act in a skilled fashion.
So recently I picked up some juggling clubs, and I hadn't done it for 15 years. And the very first time I threw them in the air, I was able to catch all three of them in a single round. And
exactly.
That's procedural memory.
Exactly.
It remembers very, very well how to do things.
It's like how a baby learns to walk.
It's how a baby learns to walk. You're right, because they don't have declarative memory, kind of the memory that I'm using right now to listen to you and think about what you're saying.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
That's conscious memory.
Conscious memory.
And declarative is the appropriate term for it.
Okay.
And it's how we learn facts and events.
Uh-huh. And so the procedural memory, so this polar bear is running, it's in the stress response, it's getting away from these scientists, I guess, who are doing this tagging.
Yes.
Goes into this anesthetized freeze state, this immobility state, and then on the other side of that is in this kind of stereotypical grand mal seizure kind of moment.
Right.
And in that, you're suggesting that the movements that the bear is making, that looks to us like a seizure, is actually its complete, I'm now putting a word there, completion of what it was doing before the sedation.
Exactly. It's completing the act of escape. In other words, it is extinguishing all of those procedural memories that, if it hadn't done that, would be stored in unconscious memory because it's a survival tool as far as the brain's concerned. It would be stored there as a false message to be replicated every time that the person experienced something that was like the event that had caused the animal to freeze. So it is completing in its memory, procedural memory, the act of escape, in essence.
And by doing so, in some way extinguishing the feeling of threat.
All the body sensations associated with that event are now extinguished because it's like ringing the bell without feeding the animal.
Okay, it's like ringing the bell without feeding the animal.
In other words,
you're referring to Pavlov, I guess.
Exactly, because it is classical conditioning. That's how we learn to survive. All of Pavlov's tools that he used to condition animals with were survival tools.
Food.
Food and pain, mainly.
Food and pain. Those are two very compelling survival tools.
Survival tools. And that's with classical conditioning. It's how we learn how to survive. We learn how to perform acts with procedural memory for skills. We learn how to survive procedural memory for traumatic events. And we acquire this information that suggests certain things are threatening to us by conditioned responses.
And when these responses are elicited by a traumatic stressor, something that's threatening, that instigates the fight-flight response, or even, if necessary, the freeze response, if that process of fighting and fleeing and even freezing is able to complete, you're suggesting that you can stand up and kind of walk away from the event to some extent almost as if the thing didn't happen, or at least it didn't happen, and keep you stuck there inside it, the feeling of it continuing to happen?
Exactly. This is a phenomenon of the present moment and the past.
The present moment and the past.
In the present moment, we are moving along through life, acquiring new information, planning, expressing intention. In trauma, when a person has these unconscious procedural memories still there, they're perceived, if there's a cue, as being in the present moment. And so they keep interrupting that process of moving on consciously in life. And so we progressively become stuck in the past in trauma.
Almost like replaying things that happened.
Exactly.
And you mean that in a very literal sense, like the brain actually like saying to you, that thing is still happening.
Exactly.
Okay, Bob, you've got there this kind of sense of like that there's this completion possible, and then we're kind of noting that there is some way that you can end up maintaining or kind of accumulating those procedural memory instructions.
Yes.
What would be the difference? Like, why would one person or the polar bear or some animal or some human, why would one complete and another would have that completion disrupted to where they were maintaining these survival instincts or survival cues?
And that's the core of trauma.
That's the core of trauma. That question right there is the core. Okay.
Which is how resilient they are. And what creates resiliency? What creates resiliency is predominantly the way you experience life in your earliest childhood. Because each time that you freeze and don't come out of it, the burden of trauma goes up and up and up. And so once you've been traumatized, you'll be more likely to be traumatized again. And after you're traumatized again, you're even more likely to be traumatized again. And that because you tend to freeze more readily. So the infant who dissociates or freezes, and dissociation is this what you experience when you freeze. They are the same element. Mm-hmm. When the child dissociates because they get fondled or they get smacked or they get hit, or even if they never have a chance to become attuned to their mother, which is integral to developing a sense of self, who you are, under those circumstances you are more likely to be traumatized. And so you are traumatized again and again. And when I discovered, and that's in the literature as well.
That's out there.
Yeah, and when I read that, I started to take histories on all my whiplash victims.
What'd you find?
And all my chronic pain patients. They all had traumatic childhoods. All of them. Many were incest victims, these women. Many were physically abused. All of them had terribly dysfunctional, stressful family lives, most of which were demeaning to them. They were not valued. And so they never developed this sense of safety and of self-sufficiency. And they always, therefore, tended to be helpless in an event.
And that goes back to something I've heard you say before, where you're, and correct me or improve upon what I might say here, you've said that trauma is the response, like the incompletion in the face of helplessness. Is that?
Trauma is a negative life event,
life experience,
which can be life-threatening, and it usually is, in the face of helplessness.
in the face of helplessness.
That combination, life threat and helplessness, is what constitutes trauma. But there's a shade of meaning there, which has a huge application to what this is.
Wow, that'd be an interesting shade to kind of shine some light on.
Well, the meaning of the event may be trivial to one person and overwhelming to another based on their past experience.
Exactly. And that past experience, what you're suggesting in terms of resiliency, is either kind of compelling one person toward greater sense of helplessness or another person toward a greater sense of agency.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Which, of course, that led to the second book, which is the trauma spectrum, because if that's the case, then trauma is a bell curve, and their trauma may be relatively trivial.
But you could still...
But if you're helpless...
It would be...
Foreclosure on your home?
Right, potentially relatively trivial, however...
Could be profoundly traumatic.
Profoundly.
So these kinds of things... I think are a major consideration in what trauma is. And it has application in a number of areas in our current economic problems and exposure to warfare.
Right, which is, of course,
a
huge issue. Throughout human history and particularly right now.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So a stressor, a challenge, a traumatic event, something that's life-threatening, does not necessarily by its nature determine that you're going to walk away from it feeling like that event isn't over, that you have to have all of these exaggerated startle and disrupted patterns or life experiences where you're kind of in your stream but really feeling like some horrible thing from the past is still happening today.
Right.
So just to go through an event does not necessarily mean that you're going to end up that way, and lots of people are. And part of what you're suggesting, if I hear you right, is that the majority of people who are affected in that way, who end up with post-traumatic stress disorder or other traumatic stress spectrum kind of things, you're going to see some kind of relevance to their past, their history of this accumulated stress, going back all the way to childhood.
Yes, especially in childhood.
Especially in childhood.
Yeah. There's several studies in the Vietnam War on the causes or incidents of PTSD and what factors seem to contribute to it. And one obviously was the intensity of the combat experience.
Of course.
And of course in our current Iraq War, it's the number of deployments and how much active combat one experienced. The second was the psychosocial life before going to war. It was rather vaguely tested, but it had to do with the stability of the home situation in which the soldier grew up.
Well,
but it never talked about trauma per se. With unstable social environments in a draftee in those days was one of the major predictors of developing PTSD.
So you're describing a government study, or at least some official study.
Yeah, it was not a government study,
Okay.
but a study in the field of psychology.
Okay.
As the diagnosis of PTSD was emerging.
Well, I think what I was going to get at there is that you're describing something that almost points to what you eventually end up saying, but doesn't either quite get there or doesn't accept the relevance of it or doesn't see the ultimate connection.
Well, the studies didn't look at whether this was traumatic in childhood. It just looked at the psychosocial experiences of that individual. And it had to do mainly with social disruption, being arrested, having, I don't even think they looked at abuse or severe trauma in childhood. They just looked at the stability of the environment at that time.
Which, from your perspective, mine too, you could use as signals of what the family of origin environment was like. So one of the things that looks like you've been busy doing, and it seems when I read your work, when I listen to you speak, it really does seem like it's taken quite a lot of work. You've been going through the literature progressively, findings, these kind of studies, that when taken together, describe what you've kind of pointed toward as this trauma spectrum.
Yes.
Right? Where one person might have less of these impacts, another person might be debilitated by them, unable to leave their house, right? But at some fundamental level, even physically, procedural memory-wise, neurologically, autonomic nervous system functioning-wise, they're within a shared experience of relative resiliency, right? And the more distressed is this description of less resiliency.
Yes.
And has that been easy to do? Like to piece together? Like have the pieces kind of just been waiting for somebody to come put them together? Or have you had to kind of pull stuff out of the sky and do lots of tests that hadn't ever been done before?
No, I've done a lot of work in studying the literature. I've followed leads that I would come up with, and I'd follow this lead into a certain body of literature and then develop it from that. As I've done that, I've come at it from a totally different perspective than a behavioral scientist.
Oh, that's probably a good thing.
I've come at it as a neurologist, as a neurophysiologist, as someone who looks at the brain and its operations in these processes. And I have not gone at it with the tyranny of the DSM-4, the description of the mental illnesses that are separable, diagnosable, and categorized for the purpose of, I guess, nosology, names, and attributions. I never believed much in that because I early on felt it was simply a bell curve because all of the diagnoses blended together. And it was notoriously so that there were cross symptoms in each diagnosis that were inevitable. None of them was a pure case of appendicitis. They were a compendium of things that were common to other things but were especially prominent. And so I thought this was probably an artificial separation of this. So I looked at mental illness as being, early on, all trauma-based. And I have a subchapter in the trauma spectrum about nature via nurture, about whether or not mental illness is only a defined entity or whether it's just a compendium of different symptoms which varies between different people with the same diagnosis. And also whether it's genetic or not.
Right, or whether or not it's tuned by the behavioral environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, as we know now with the epigenome, brain genes have to be triggered and switched on.
Right, the epigenome, go ahead and explain the epigenome.
Epigenome is another set of genes, simply put. This is very,
simply put is probably a
simplistic.
good way for us to do.
It's another set of genes that's there by itself and that respond to experience.
And experience happens and it tells it to do something.
And the epigenome is switched on. And then the epigenome switches on or off the gene pool.
So that you'll get various genetic traits expressing based on what the epigenome has triggered off.
So what we've got here is a direct link between life experience and the genetic expression of a person's genome.
Wow.
And okay, now what do we do?
No.
Is bipolar, or is it bipolar secondary to the experience of a bipolar parent?
Exactly.
And of course, if you look at the Holocaust studies, this is a dramatic demonstration of how trauma can be generational through the behavior of the parent. And the incidence of suicide and PTSD in children of the Holocaust is astronomical. It's like 20% suicide rate in children of Holocaust survivors. And in the next generation of grandchildren, it's also extremely high. And that's not genetic. That's switching on certain genes if it is genetic, or perhaps it's the unconscious inability of the mother to attune.
and thus set up for poor resiliency in the child, and then life experience to set off these traumatic reactions.
And it's not just, I'm not blaming the mother in this.
It can't be at all.
No, the behavior of the parents are determined by their life experience.
Precisely.
And they can or can't provide what is needed for a child based on that.
Quite simply because their nervous system is organized around the fight, flight, or freeze reaction,
exactly,
which is making it impossible for them to kind of be present in the present moment to the needs of their child.
So we know that behavioral disruptions, that mental illness, that suicide, that depression can be generational and familial. We know that. It's not a question. And if so, doesn't that apply to all mental illness, which basically are different expressions based on the nuances of the negative life experience? And isn't most everything due to trauma, such as...
I you just took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
I was just like, you're essentially, if you're going to go there with mental illness, then you're going to go there with chronic pain, you're going to go through there with gastrointestinal issues, you're going to go there with
addictions.
With addictions, exactly. Period.
Addictions are due to trauma. And the addiction field is beginning to come around to that.
I see that in the Meadows and the refuge in Florida and such.
Absolutely. And I'm now invited to go to addiction conferences. And 5 years ago, I wasn't.
That fast?
Oh, yeah. You
said it's a tidal wave earlier when we were talking before.
Yeah, it's growing.
Tsunami, I think you said. Yeah. It's just coming on that people are getting aware of this.
Yeah. So a lot of the dysfunctional things that we experience, including our health, we're finding are due to early childhood negative life experience. There's a study, and I should probably bring this in now, by Vincent Felitti back in the early 90s, called the ACE study, Adverse Child Event Study.
Right, kind of a famous one.
Very famous,
right.
But also not accepted in the medical field.
Even though it was kind of commissioned by...
It was done by Kaiser Hospital System.
Right. Yeah.
And Vincent Felitti and his cohorts studied negative life events on a scale of 1 to 10 based on intensive, perceived intensity. Anything from terrible physical abuse, sexual abuse, ritual abuse, to the mental illness of a parent, mm-hmm. or the addiction of a parent. Mm-hmm. A whole spectrum of negative life experiences, numerically graded for severity. And again, that's arbitrary, but can be done reasonably accurately. And then they followed these people over 20 years, and the study's still going on. And very soon, probably within 15 years, they discovered that there's a direct connection between these 10 or so negative categories of experience and the person's susceptibility to most of the major causes of death, including heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, addictions, depression, mental illness, suicide.
That negative childhood experience directly correlates to later, even the classic things that we pick up and read in Time magazine, cardiac arrest, #1 killer in the country.
Yeah. Oh, cardiac disease, liver disease are among the highest. Cardiac disease, one of the highest. So physical illness correlates with these negative life events.
Physical illness.
And emotional illness, and in many of its expressions.
And you're tracking, and I think the new traumatology field is tracking these negative life experiences down to the regulatory capacity of the autonomic nervous system.
Which is a real key here. I mean, this is a key to the whole picture in a sense.
If we weren't to identify that, we would just say, oh, you have a bad experience, you're going to end up having this bad future. But this points towards something else.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. There's several articles by a well-known psychologist, Seymour Antelman, A-N-T-E-L-M-A-N, and his colleagues, 3 articles, I believe, on cyclical autonomic dysregulation, meaning sympathetic parasympathetic cycling, which if it's very smooth and regulated is called homeostasis. It's an optimal balanced state of health. In trauma, they propose that this is now an exaggerated cycling from extremes of parasympathetic, which is the freeze, to extremes of sympathetic, which is the fight-flight, which continues and is triggered any time there's a cue to threat. Not only will the person go into a fight-flight response, they will go into this exaggerated cycling. And that's very bad for the body.
Right. You shouldn't have to go into those responses unless you're being chased.
Right. Right. And so it's a dangerous state to be in.
Right.
And that probably is a good model for what happens in trauma, that you are in a state of severe autonomic abnormal regulation. And of course, all of the psychosomatic diseases have both parasympathetic and sympathetic states.
Cycling within them.
Yes, constipation and diarrhea and irritable bowel, sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Right. One is tight and one is over loose.
That's right.